The initial impression was that Kody Brown was the perfect patriarch, calm, composed, and in control. The surface-level view led one to believe that he was a loving husband and a loving dad, and that he was what had been holding the sister wives' family together. To the passing observer, life in the world of the Browns appeared to be pretty much faultless. They smiled for the cameras, shared meals, had vacation getaways, and appeared to be what could best be described as a perfect blended polygamous family. However, as in so many other instances, what was really going on was a completely different matter. Kody's control was not occasional or casual. It was deliberate, detailed, and comprehensive. Every aspect, from simple domestic chores to major family matters, was controlled by Kody. Where the wives would live, what they would do in their lives, what activities the kids were allowed to pursue, even what was to be said in family conversations. Everything was to go through his careful vetting. What may seem no more than normal family organization to an outsider was often a kind of emotional imprisonment within the Brown family premises. The wives were always living with this pressure. Anticipate Kody's needs and conform your actions to meet them. Christine, Janelle, Robyn, and Meri all had distinct personalities, hopes, and dreams. However, these were eventually shelved. The wives quickly realized that disagreeing with Kody was unfathomable, even when done in a respectful way. A disagreement may mean more than just an angry word. Oftentimes, punishment follows in minute, passive ways, in ignoring, in exclusion from certain decisions, in disapproving stares. As for children, too, were affected by this control exerted over them. Right from a very young age, they had to learn to walk on edge about Kody's moods and to avoid saying the wrong thing, to avoid punishment for no reason at all. It wasn't possible for them to have freedom even in their home life, because everything had been very carefully planned to suit Kody's ideology of discipline and submission. Meals, trips, and even family gatherings had been influenced by this ideology of order and obedience as dream-stitched by Kody. But behind this strictly regulated household, the wives would air their gripes behind closed doors, away from prying eyes. The toll of putting up a show for the cameras and the fact that they were forced to live with the domineering presence of Kody would come up for debate. This was a situation each of the wives dealt with in different ways. Some tuned out and into their own thoughts. Some attempted to bargain for a bit of liberty, and a few just bit their tongues and waited for a change to come about through the virtue of being patient. However, behind the facade, an unsettling mood hung suspended like a brewing storm cloud. The very representation of the family on the television screen was also edited to support the idea of familial cohesion. Kody Brown appeared to be the wise, calm patriarch, the glue that all the rest hung together with, while the arguments were muted or cut out. The world was treated to smiling faces, pre-rehearsed dialogue, and what appeared to be a united family. It would have never occurred to most that these subtleties of power, displeasure, and restraint had actually existed behind the camera. The reality TV show had captured the action, but not the meaning. This pressure to keep up appearances exacted a psychological cost on all parties. The wives began to question themselves. Am I being ridiculous? Is it really this bad, or am I imagining things? Slowly, the realization sank in. It wasn't just a matter of who was in charge, who got to call the shots. It was a matter of muzzling the voice, dictating the action, and circumscribing the liberty. Yet, despite the firm grip that Kody maintained, small cracks began to develop. These small cracks started off as a whisper, a lingering pout, a muffled talk that ensued during the later hours of the night. The children began to feel that everything was not as it should be. Visitors to the house, friends and family, could feel that something was amiss. But none could quite put a finger on exactly what that was, as if it was a facade that was a work of perfection until you peered behind it. Kody's controlling tendencies permeated every aspect of the household. Outings with the children were choreographed to the last detail, including practice sessions. Matters regarding vacations, education, or places of worship remained unilateral, with Kody having the final say. There was even control exercised in matters of birthdays or other special occasions. The tightrope existence experienced by the wives was a life in which a single wrong move could mean a stir of discontent. The longer the degree of Kody's control remained in effect, the more indicative it was that the wives remained resourceful. Yes, they had grown accustomed to the way he ran things, but they were silently gaining power, becoming more aware, learning more about the injustice of it all. Taking steps to show their newfound freedom might involve tiny gestures, almost minuscule, such as Christine choosing to spend the afternoon engaged in her own favorite pastime, Janelle working one-on-one with a kid on a creative project, or Robyn branching out to make her own friendships in other aspects of her life. Family dynamics were equal parts fear, habit, and carefully managed negotiation. The wives knew which battles were worth fighting and which ones were best left alone. The rhythm of the family revolved around the decisions of Kody, but there were moments, fleeting moments of glory, when personal expression managed to creep through the crevices. It was these moments of freedom that managed to instill seeds of hope. Yet, despite the amount of control he had, Kody could not foresee one possible consequence: the moment when the truth would finally come forth in such a manner that it could not be disregarded, denied, or covered up. The recordings, the tapes, the little peeks at the truth, that was all building, waiting patiently in the wings. Little did Kody know that the tools he had been using so effectively in building his secret world would prove instrumental in the eventual unveiling of the truth. Everything was in place for a huge shakeup to take place. For a long time, Kody's power had appeared absolute. He had dictated the pace of the family's life, suppressed opposition to his rule, and created the image of a perfect family. Yet the signs of the weakness in Kody's power had been growing increasingly evident over time. Behind the facade of the Brown family life, a storm had been brewing for a long time. And when the storm finally came, the last piece of the puzzle would be in place to show the real extent of the manipulation and control under the surface in a family he pretended to love. There was so much going behind those carefully painted smiles in interviews and those so nice TV appearances. This was not a life in peace in the Brown family. Life under Kody Brown's leadership was full of tension in the air, a suppressed, palpable tension that had been building up all these years, as if a storm was waiting to burst. Behind those united smiles in public was an emotionally complex place. Kody's power went beyond decision-making to influence, control, and impact on all those around him. All decisions made by the wives, right from spending time to expressing themselves, were observed and, at places, nudged to change course. For an outsider, it would seem as if all these were only marginal corrections, a hint here, a pointer there. For those living amidst it, it became a normal practice, which was impossible to escape. The wise wives created a language of warning. A sigh, a lifted eyebrow, a pause in speech, any of these could be a sign of disappointment or trouble. Christine, Janelle, Robyn, and Meri coped with this complex in their own way. Christine tended to withdraw into herself, taking comfort in solitary moments and private rituals. Janelle made every attempt to create a space to herself, to preserve her own interests and activities whenever the opportunity arose. Robyn, ever the mediator, set about finding a way to circumvent a conflict while still satisfying herself. And Meri, with her long-established resentments, often silently suffered while struggling to keep a smooth running of the household. The children were also very sensitive to the ambience surrounding them. Living in a family where the presence of both parents would mean very little when the word of either counted for so much, makes a child not only grow up in a unique family setup, but also develop a lifetime perspective on things. The Brown children had to be very careful in a very subtle game of do's and don'ts in the family. Anything less, wanting to attend a friend's party, opting for school extracurricular activities, or even airing their views, could easily mean a subtly inflicted punishment in the form of ignoring the child, or subtly reprimanding her without ever actually doing so. The conflict was not only centered on what was being said, but also what wasn't being said. Many nonverbal examples of control existed that were nearly invisible to the outsider looking into these relationships. Examples would be for a man like Kody to change the subject if he didn't want to discuss a particular issue, or to withhold affection or recognition if a woman dared to express an opinion he didn't want to hear. Even so, despite the invisible pressure of control, life was not entirely grim for the wives. There were moments of merriment, fleeting moments of independence, and times when the entire family functioned together as one. Even these experiences were nonetheless characterized by the presence of restraint. There were no moments of unconditional freedom, because these were subject to the parameters that Kody himself drew. The pressures of living like this have led to a series of coping mechanisms. For Christine, it was a delicate balance, learning how to arrange her day to avoid conflict while still creating her own moments of respite. For Janelle, a solution was to turn elsewhere, finding refuge among her associates or family, consistently reminding herself that there is something distinct about her. For Robyn, it was a role that made her content, allowing her to see how to handle a room, how to stay out of situations, a true expert at reading between the lines. This underlying tension also trickled into family interactions with the children. While it seemed to be a loving family, going on fun outings and enjoying celebrations, in reality, most of the decisions that were made were in terms of edicts from Kody, which did not necessarily involve consultations with the women or even the children's choice. Their visitors to the homes were even sometimes aware of this underlying tension. Disagreements, when they arose, were skillfully handled. These very few instances of disagreement had less chance of turning into an open dispute because the women were well aware of the power plays involved. A disagreement might well be taken as insolence, and this could disrupt the tranquility of domestic bliss. But above the carefully controlled veil of this domestic setup, the pressure cooker of frustration and anger simmered unobtrusively. Though the wives reacted in different ways to the situation, the one thing they shared in common is the fact that life under the domination of Kody was choking. Personal choices became a source of negotiations. Ambitions and desires were put off, altered, and abandoned in order to hold the family together. It went beyond the question of authority. It went beyond the fact of domination. It went to a basic imbalance. Conversely, the more the wives were subject to these restrictions, the greater their resource was to cope. They began to see the injustice of it and started looking for ways to assert themselves. Some of them found ways to have a hobby, some time to think, some way to express themselves. Others made a close friend who was a source of love and support, separate from their roles as wife and mother. The wives realized that while control may alter behavior, it cannot alter thoughts, desires, and wills. The latent tensions were further fueled by the dynamics among the wives themselves. In the polygamous family, where one patriarch, the husband, reigns supreme, there was latent competition, comparison, and envy among the wives. However, paradoxically, it also brought solidarity among the wives. The wives experienced commonalities that would have been difficult for outsiders to understand. They could disagree on the smaller things in life, but the common struggle in living with Kody brought solidarity among the wives that was unspoken, yet deeply profound. At the same time, the involvement of the children was also rising in awareness concerning these dynamics. Watching their mother's sacrifices in addition to the limitations caused by Kody, the kids became puzzled by the justice of it all. The kids witnessed how their mothers managed space, advocated on their behalf without much fanfare, and at times toiled with emotional turmoil in order to keep the family together. This tension extended beyond individual experiences to the public face of the family. Sister Wives was shown on the television program as having elements of joy, merriment, and even the occasional dispute among the women, but the more subtle dynamics of power had been hidden from the audience. This was the public face the roll-off women had created. Many viewers found the difference difficult to reconcile with the information shared quietly behind closed doors. Nonetheless, despite all the tensions, the wives managed to adjust. They mastered the art of knowing when to talk, when to shut up, and when to exercise their liberties without provoking a storm. They were experts at resisting small acts of liberty, tiny rebellions, and moments of self-choice that enabled them to preserve their individuality in a strictly controlled setting. It was these acts of liberation that, in the end, played a pivotal role in developing a significant epiphany. That control, as complete as it may appear, is not constant. It was during this time of subtle tension that the roots of future disruptions in the family would be established. The wives began to chronicle their experiences, either consciously or unconsciously, setting in motion a pattern of subtle manipulation and silent perseverance that would one day serve as the substance of proof that would call the entire foundation of Kody's authority into question. But before the final tape could be found, these underlying tensions had worked their magic. They had enhanced their sense of womanhood, their strength, and their sensitivity to injustice. The gripes and misunderstandings that appeared trivial and petty on the surface had actually been symptomatic of deep-seated imbalances. The wives had suffered, learned, and matured, and this had prepared them, unwittingly, for that moment in which they would come face to face with the truth and regain their voice. For so many years, Kody Brown's dominance had been absolute. He ran the household, made all the rules, and even managed the family's public face. Yet even the most precise management has its limitations. And none could have anticipated the tempest brewing with a lone, cryptic tape. The tape wasn't just a home recording. It wasn't some sort of casual or irrelevant thing. It was a tape that recorded the unvarnished truth of life for the Brown family, events and discusses, and admissions that Kody had been able to control and alter. The mere fact that it existed was sufficient to undermine what had been built over many years, and those who found it knew what it might mean. The tape's history began quietly. It lay among other family tapes, tucked away in a location that Kody thought no one would ever happen upon. Maybe he thought of it as a kind of private record, proof of the choices he and his ex-wife made. Or maybe it was just a relic of the past. But sometimes, the thing we try to hide the best is the thing that gets the most attention. One of the family happened upon the tape among the old trunks. They did not know the significance of the tape at the time, but it all changed when they pressed play. The video was astounding. The nature of their discourse, previously labeled as collaborative or harmonious, was one person speaking, not asking a question, not making a request, but giving a direction. The addition, allegedly arrived at through joint consent, was actually imposed on the others by Kody. The incriminating video recorded how he did it, at times subtly, through persuasion or threatening silence. The emotions, opinions, and dissents of the women, previously silenced or disregarded, were now etched, unabridgeable, and irreversible. Christine, Janelle, Robyn, and Meri had a sense that Kody's control was more than what seemed to be on the surface. But witnessing it on tape was a revelation. It was no longer a mere feeling or impression. The tape was proof in the sense that it was a record of the manipulation, control, and orchestration of family dynamics in accordance with Kody's desires on the videotape. Every expression, a word, a movement, a gesture of control was recorded on the tape. The tape was both frightening and exhilarating to the women. It was frightening in the sense that it was an exposure of years of control in its most detailed form. It was also exhilarating in that it proved what they had all suspected to be true, that their voice was silenced and their freedom was limited. The first reaction was one of shock. The questions just flooded the minds of those who found the tape. Why was the tape even hidden? Exactly what was on the tape? Could something like this be built on in order to confront Kody? Or was it just something that showed the history? As they watched the tape, the answer became clear. This was more than just history. This was the key toward changing the dynamics that had been in the household. The tape recorded on it depicted a threatening level of control. In one section, Kody conducting a family meeting in a manner that made the participation of his wives unavoidable, while he portrayed it as a joint discussion when in fact everything had been decided in advance. In another part, a wife was skillfully undermined in her objections, her views being labeled as misconceptions or outbursts. The tape recorded events that were taking place behind the scenes, events that resulted in the facade of a harmonious household being kept up. The tape was educational for the children as well. There was always a feeling of tension and control that the children had been aware of. But witnessing it and experiencing it firsthand reinforced what the children knew instinctively about their father and his behavior. The choices that he made were always deemed to be fair or instructive, but the truth was, these were examples of power being exercised. The children realized that even the liberty they enjoyed was being arrived at after negotiations that they were not aware of. The women started to talk about how they should handle the tape. The tape was definitely something that could not be denied, and the consequences were serious. There were women worried about the potential fighting that could result if the tape was used to challenge Kody. Others saw it as their chance to speak out after all these years. Analyzing the tape also brought about reflection on the part of the audience and the wives as well. All the wives looked into the past and remembered instances wherein they had silently suffered through tough times. Situations wherein they had wanted to voice an opinion, but had chosen to withhold it, lest they encounter disapproval and tension. This tape was like a mirror that reflected the control that Kody exercised, as well as the strength they had been able to build through silence. The finding of the tape had a significant impact on the power struggles that had long existed in the Brown household. For the first time, the wives had proof of the power they had suffered. For all these years, Kody's power had never been questioned. And that had been because he had managed to create a particular impression. That impression was now being eroded. However, the videotape revealed not control, but patterns. These were the ways in which the decisions had been made, the ways in which voices had been suppressed, the ways in which the family had been run, as if under a unified vision. This is not merely a story about control in a family, but about the construction of reality along the preferences of an individual. Every family tradition, every element of child upbringing, every journey made or not made, or every routine at home that appeared normal had depths of manipulation. The emotional impact on the wives was tremendous. Relief and outrage intertwined. Confirmation and irritation mingled. To view the evidences of manipulation was to confront the emotions they had suppressed for so long. Tears flowed freely. Some of them sat in numb silence, and some of them felt the beginning of a strong sense of empowerment gripping their hearts. For the first time ever, the underlying tension of their marriage had physical evidence of its validity. However, the children observed all of this closely, realizing that their parents' dynamic was much more complex than the story they had been told. The tape gave them insight, Richard says in an interview. It gave them a tool to understand the patterns of relationships. The tape provided them with understanding about the invisible patterns of control. The video also portrayed Kody's lack of ability to predict when some outcomes would happen. For all his control, he was unable to predict when evidence of his manipulation would come to light. He had all the power, but recorded evidence would not go away. It became a symbol, a representation that despite all constructed systems of power, those systems can fail, and the truth finds a way out, despite all motives to keep it hidden. With this tape in hand, however, it was time to determine the next move. To go directly at Kody with irrefutable evidence was sure to be dynamite, though to remain quiet was no longer an option. The tape had begun to alter dynamics within the family. There was now confirmation of feelings to which family members could relate. The finding of the tape was the start of a critical phase. The women now had solid evidence in their hands, not only to endure the control, but to resist it. The family was no longer a precisely choreographed ballet of Kody's domination, but was now in a state of chaos. What was absolute was now up for debate. For those watching the Brown family, the tape was a revelation. The reality TV arguments that had been portrayed as minor squabbles now had the status of years of insidious manipulation. It was clear that the story of the family had something to offer, something that was not simply reality TV, but a case study in power and the strength that those who took a stand had to rebuild their voices. The final tape was more than a recording. It was a key, a door that opened to unlock hidden truths, a challenge to an already existing order, a way to give a voice to those who had been silenced. And as the family was about to discover its truth, nothing would ever be the same. The moment the final tape had been discovered, the atmosphere in the Brown household had changed completely. Unspoken tension that had been simmering beneath the surface now demanded attention. The tape exposed some truths that could no longer be ignored. A mixture of fear, relief, and determination by the wives Christine, Janelle, Robyn, and Meri. For the very first time, they had concrete proof about the control, manipulation, and silencing they had endured for years. It wasn't a light decision to attack Kody. Each wife knew the risks. Bringing the tape into daylight might mean anger, defensiveness, or even emotional fallout. Yet, after years of walking on eggshells, they also understood that silence was no longer an option. The power dynamic that had dictated their lives for so long was shifting, and this was their chance to reclaim their voices. It was a tense first confrontation. The wives huddled together, tape in hand, emotions running high. Christine spoke first, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "We've seen this," she said, holding the tape as if it were both a shield and a weapon. "This shows what's been happening all these years. We need to talk, all of us, openly, honestly." Kody was calm at first and tried to deflect. He attempted to characterize the tape as misinterpreted, edited, or incomplete. But the evidence was irrefutable. Every moment of manipulation, every subtle exercise of authority, every silenced objection, it was all there, captured for anyone to see. For the first time, Kody's usual control tactics weren't enough. He could not rewrite history, and he could not silence the proof that had been recorded. As the discussion went on, words of emotion erupted. Janelle, silent for so long, now found her voice. "I have tried to accept things, to make life work, but this isn't about the decisions. It's about control over every aspect of our lives. We have lived in your shadow for too long." Her raw, direct words spoke volumes for the other wives too, as their frustrations had been bottled up inside all these years in an effort to hold on to harmony. Now with the tape playing, they were free to speak, and speak with a force none could ignore. Robyn, often the mediator, shared what it had been like to live in this unending fishbowl called family life. "Every choice we make is filtered through what you approve of. Even when we try to express ourselves, we feel there's always a ceiling to break through. This tape proves it. We can't continue like this." Her voice was calm, yet firm and strong from years of emotional labor. Meri, silent longer than anyone, let loose with the frustration that had been in her belly for 2 decades. "I've stayed quiet to avoid conflict. But silence doesn't mean consent. We've all sacrificed parts of ourselves to maintain the family image. That stops now." Her word struck a chord, not only within the family, but in the realization that the tape had shifted the balance of power. It was an eye-opener for the children to hear their mothers talk so candidly. Growing up, they may have sensed the tension, but had often not been clear about things. Now, when they heard their mothers say what was bothering them, they found validation of what they intuitively knew. They saw the courage it takes to speak to authority, and realized even the most dominant personality can be faced when the truth is overwhelming. As the debate continued to unfold, Kody lost composure. The absolute power that had gone unchallenged now faced resistance on fronts he never anticipated. Every tactic he relied on, charm, deflection, persuasion, fell flat in the face of documented evidence. The tape didn't just tell a story. It held undeniable proof of the power imbalance and revealed a pattern of manipulation that could no longer be denied or minimized. It was riveting when, for the first time, his wives looked at specific scenes in the tape and went over them together, pausing, rewinding, and dissecting the conversations. In each clip, subtle yet clear-cut forms of control were revealed, framing discussions as collaboration when decisions had already been predetermined, dismissing objections as emotional overreactions, and the invisible pressure to toe the line, according to Kody's vision. For the first time, the wives could collectively see the depth of influence he had exerted over them, and it was both shocking and validating. The confrontation was emotional, raw, and, at moments, chaotic. Tears flowed, voices rose, and anger long suppressed finally erupted. But in the midst of turmoil, a sense of liberation began to take hold. The wives realized that for years they had endured silently, internalizing frustration and fear, but now they had a voice. They had evidence. And they had each other. It was not only a confrontation about past control, but also a declaration about the future. The wives made it clear that the old dynamics could not continue. "We will no longer be silenced," Christine said firmly. "We have a right to speak, to choose, and to live our lives fully. The tape proves what we've known all along, and now it's time for change." The revelations weren't just about authority and control. They revealed how emotions, relationships, and personal choice had been minusculely oriented to suit one man's vision. Decisions about schooling, family traditions, holidays, even the minor routines of each day came into sharp view as expressions of power done with calculated intent to keep a person subordinated. It was a painful but enlightening realization. The confrontation was a turning point for Kody. For the first time, he had to face the fact that his authority was limited. The tape had dislocated the neatly presented family image and purportedly proved that control can be documented, defied, and finally counterbalanced. To a certain extent, the tape had made a shift in the narrative, from the one constructed on obedience and domination to the one of truth, accountability, and blossoming self-governance. The wives' confrontation also sparked conversations about boundaries. For years, they had made their way in life according to silent rules. Explicit boundaries were now being set. They started making boundaries on areas of personal choice, asserting independence, and creating areas where their voices were heard. This was not rebellion just for the sake of rebellion, but about reclaiming dignity and agency. Notably, confrontation also joined the wives together. Years of tension among them finally gave them the courage that created solidarity. They were no longer isolated in their experiences. It was as if the tape validated not just their feelings as individuals, but more to the point, a reality shared collectively. Altogether, they became an act to reckon with, most surprisingly, challenging long-set-in-concrete power dynamics. Yet beyond the family itself, there was meaning in the confrontation to the audience. An audience of viewers who followed this story for years saw something quite different from reality TV arguments or bickering. A real emotional weight and consequence. The tape and the confrontation exposed complexities of authority, control, and resilience inside a family, much deeper than any television surface-level drama. Ultimately, it was about empowerment, healing, and reclamation, rather than exposure to control. The tape had given them undoubted proof. But the wives' courage, clarity, and unity turned that moment into a point of change. They had withstood, witnessed, and survived years of manipulation, and now they felt ready, with the evidence to prove it, and voices together, to take back the reins of their lives. By the end of the session, they were on new ground. The patterns of silence and suppression, of quiet endurance, were breaking. Decisions that had been considered absolute were now up for debate. The power Kody had exerted for years was no longer unquestioned. Most importantly, the wives had begun to find the freedom to be open and authentic, to express themselves in a way which had been denied for a long time. The stage was now set for the final session, a glimpse into how the Brown family was going to steer through this new reality, get their autonomy back, and turn over a new leaf in life where one word, control, would no longer overshadow their voices. The conflict was over, but the effect of it would be felt for years. This confrontation with Kody, brought about by the finding of that final tape, really marked a new beginning for the Brown family. A sense of control, subtle manipulation, and emotional restraint had dictated daily interactions for many years. Now, however, undeniable evidence finally gave rise to voices, and the dynamics of authority began to shift. The family was stepping into new territory, a place marked equally by both possibility and uncertainty. For the wives, this was more than a confrontation. This was a liberation. Christine, Janelle, Robyn, and Meri had been negotiating through all the rules, expectations, and delicately maintained appearances for years. So they learned how to survive, and find those tiny pieces of personal freedom. But with the tapes, revelations, and their candid confrontation, those tiny pieces began to expand into something much greater than themselves. A real chance to reclaim autonomy, redefine boundaries, and live authentically. Christine, a number of times an onlooker, felt this as an empowering phase. She started taking decisions and did not take it to heart in case she received any form of retribution or silent judgment. The trivial decisions, which family activities to take part in, how to manage her time, what personal projects to pursue, gained significance since she began to realize that they no longer had to be approved by others to gain credibility. This freedom was intoxicating, but it also called for guts. Every step out toward independence acted as a reminder that she was getting back pieces of herself that had long been held tight. Whereas Janelle previously sought small spaces for independence, she now felt empowered to pursue big things. She participated more openly in decisions about her personal life, her career, and her family interactions. The years of quiet compromise had granted her patience and resilience, but now also clarity. Janelle realized the power of collective support through her co-wives, and the necessity of voicing opinions that had long been held inside. For Robyn, the family mediator, her role had changed. She had always been the one who could diffuse tension and smooth things over. But the information revelations allowed her to redefine her role within the family. No longer in charge of keeping emotional equilibrium within the family, she could now focus on genuine communication, support for the other wives, and raising her voice. The experience of negotiation turned an instrument of compliance into one of empowerment. Meri, who had endured silently the longest, perhaps underwent one of the most profound shifts. She felt she had been living in a circle of suppression and silent endurance for far too long. Now, as the tape validated years of experience, she began to state her wants and needs loud and clear. It wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about self-respect, stating independence, and stepping into a future where her voice mattered. The children also learned their way into this new reality, raised by such a leading figure as Kody. Their sense of authority and compliance had been tempered, but watching their mothers stand up was an invaluable lesson. They realized even the most deeply entrenched structures could be changed, and that through truthfulness, bravery, and unity, changes could be made. Little by little, the family's next generation was coming of age and beginning to learn about autonomy, accountability, and the importance of personal agency. Change, as they say, is not all honey and cream. It tends to bring with it its fair measure of friction, and the Brown household was no different. The fact that Kody would have to accept undeniable evidence, along with the sentiment chanted in an overwhelming chorus, only made things difficult for him. All those years, he had held absolute authority, but that bastion was being questioned for the first time. A very delicate balancing act, respect for the wives. Newfound autonomy shouldn't affect his lead role as head of the house, and the couple had to work out this truth. For the very first time, Kody felt his control had limits, and the coupled lesson he learned was that authority can't exist without consent, mutual respect, and trust. The family also had to confront old wounds. There were years of suppressed feelings, unmet expectations, and quiet frustrations that needed to be acknowledged. Conversations that were never held for fear of conflict became the center of discussion. The wives shared their experiences, agreeing on their struggles, and articulating their vision for the future. It was emotional at times, sometimes painful, yet very necessary in healing. Most surprising in this transformation, though, was the wives' solidarity. Control had worked by creating subtle divisions and moments of isolation. United now by a shared experience of empowerment, they had become advocates, not just for themselves, but for each other. They developed an understanding that their strength lay in open communication, support for one another, and assertiveness as a single unit. The revelations of the tape and the subsequent confrontation also brought about reflections on family traditions, daily routines, and long-standing practices. Decisions that were hitherto taken by Kody's whims were now being made together. The family learned to negotiate, compromise, and make choices instead of following one man's order. This did not happen overnight, but it was sure a gradual structuring of household dynamics where respect, openness, and equity were called for. This was a dramatic and inspiring transformation for those who had been following the story of Sister Wives. What once seemed like typical reality TV disagreements was now a nuanced tale of control, resistance, and empowerment. They soon realized that the family's story was not just about polygamy or living arrangements, but about human resilience, the quest for autonomy, and the courage to reclaim one's voice amidst long-standing power dynamics. Beyond internal dynamics, the tape and confrontation reshaped public perception. Longtime fans and viewers of the manufactured, harmonious image of the family now knew that behind the cameras, a different story lay. Accountability, courage, and the transformative power of truth made the Brown family's struggle not just a story of conflict, but a lesson to learn. The family set clear boundaries as they learned to live with the new configuration. These were not arbitrary rules, but agreements grounded in respect, fairness, and mutual understanding. Every family member, including Kody, now understood that authority was about collaboration and consent. The shift was subtle, yet deep. Control no longer meant dominance. It meant guidance, balanced with respect for individual autonomy. The transformation also inspired personal growth. Each wife had time to follow interests, ambitions, and relationships that had been put in second place. They pursued education, hobbies, social connections, and creative projects, all with a sense of validity and support in their decisions. For the children, the growth of their mothers around them reinforced lessons in resilience, self-respect, and the importance of standing up for oneself. Ultimately, the final tape did more than expose control. It elicited deep evolution within the family. It was a tape confirming years of quiet endurance, emphasizing the power of voices unified, and an avenue for real communication. The Brown household, once defined by hierarchy and silent compliance, was now trudging through a landscape of empowerment, accountability, and emotional honesty. This new chapter wasn't about erasing the past, but learning from it. The family recognized the patterns that had left bruises, tended to unresolved issues, and celebrated the courage it took to face those issues. They moved into a future where each member's voice counted, choices were respected, and relationships were nurtured based on mutual understanding rather than on the basis of who held the reins. In this shifted dynamic, control wasn't about suppression. It was about collaboration. The tape, once an apparent threat, now became a catalyst for growth, reflection, and lasting change. What had begun as a tool to uncover manipulation served as a reminder of resilience, courage, and the transformative power of the truth. The Brown family stepped into this new chapter, being clear, with intention and hope. They had learned that even long-enduring patterns of control could be challenged. Voices silenced for years could rise, and the power of truth and solidarity could reshape the most complex family dynamics. He was in control of everything until they discovered the final tape. It is then, in that instant, that everything will change forever. The Brown family's tale, dominated for so long by control and subtle manipulation, had flowered into one of liberation, empowerment, and courage as it dared to redefine the future. Challenges still existed, but the core of the family was stronger. Each brick bonded not with the mere mortar of authority, but with the cement of truth and respect, combined with the unrelenting strength of those who found their voices.